A 19-year-old Australian soldier is lying face down in the mud. His leg is shattered. The Japanese are 400 meters away. And the generals in Brisbane. They have no idea he even exists. This is not a war story. This is a scandal that took 80 years to expose. Because what I am about to tell you will change everything you thought you knew about the Kokoda campaign. The official history, the medals, the speeches at Anzac Day. All of it built on a lie so massive that the Australian government buried it for decades. Here is the question no one in Canberra wanted you to ask. Who actually saved our boys on that track? Was it the generals with their fancy maps? Was it the supply lines they promised but never delivered? Or was it someone else entirely? Someone the history books forgot. Someone who was paid in trinkets and then thrown away like garbage. I am talking about the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels. And before you think you know this story, you do not. Because what they did goes far beyond carrying stretchers, and what was done to them afterwards. That is the part they never taught you in school. 400 of them perished on that track. No pensions, no memorials, not even their names recorded. While the generals collected medals in air-conditioned offices. Stay until the end, because the final revelation will hit you like a punch to the gut, and you will never look at Kokoda the same way again. A 19-year-old Australian soldier lies face down in the mud of the Owen Stanley Range. His leg is shattered. His mates are retreating. The Japanese are less than 400 meters behind. And the generals in Brisbane have no idea he even exists. This is the moment when official channels fail. This is the moment when radio contact is just static. This is the moment when a Papuan villager named Raphael Oimbari kneels beside the broken body of Private George Whittington, lifts him onto his shoulders, and begins an 8-day journey through hell. The generals did not order this rescue. The supply lines did not provide for it. The official war plan never accounted for it. But it happened anyway. And it changed everything we think we know about the Kokoda campaign. The year was 1942. The month was August. And the Australian Army was facing its darkest hour since Gallipoli. Japan had swept through Southeast Asia like a monsoon. Singapore had fallen in February. The British Empire's supposedly impregnable fortress surrendered in just 7 days. 15,000 Australian prisoners marched into captivity, and suddenly the war was no longer happening on the other side of the world. It was happening in Australia's backyard, Papua New Guinea, a territory administered by Australia. A land mass separated from the Queensland coast by a strait narrow enough that Japanese bombers could refuel once and reach Darwin. But here is the part they never tell you in the textbooks. The men who would fight on the Kokoda track were not battle-hardened veterans. They were not elite commandos. They were militia soldiers, conscripts, boys who had signed up for home defense and suddenly found themselves shipped to a jungle they had never seen, fighting an enemy they had never faced, with equipment designed for European winters. The average age of the Australian soldier on the Kokoda track was 21 years old. Some were as young as 18. They called themselves the Chocos, short for chocolate soldiers. A self-deprecating joke that cut to the bone of how they had been dismissed by the regular army. And the generals. Where were the generals? General Douglas MacArthur sat in his headquarters in Brisbane, 1,600 kilometers from the fighting. He had never set foot in New Guinea. He never would during the entire campaign. His maps showed the Owen Stanley Range as a series of neat contour lines. They did not show the vertical cliff faces. They did not show the rivers that turned to torrents in minutes. They did not show the mud that could swallow a man to his waist. MacArthur looked at those maps and asked a question that would haunt the campaign. Why are they not advancing faster? But this story is not about MacArthur. And what happened next would expose the greatest lie of the entire Pacific War. Let us establish the geography, because the geography is the villain of this story, as much as the Japanese ever were. The Kokoda Track stretches approximately 96 kilometers from Ower's Corner, north of Port Moresby, to the village of Kokoda on the northern slopes of the Owen Stanley Range. 96 kilometers. In flat terrain, a fit soldier could march that in 3 days. On the Kokoda Track, it took weeks. The trail climbs to 2,100 meters at its highest point. It crosses 60 rivers and streams. It passes through some of the densest jungle on Earth. And in August 1942, the wet season was just beginning. The conditions were almost impossible to describe to someone who has not experienced tropical jungle warfare. The temperature hovered around 30 degrees Celsius. The humidity rarely dropped below 90%. A soldier's uniform was never dry. His boots rotted on his feet within weeks. The jungle canopy was so thick that sunlight rarely reached the ground. Men marched in perpetual twilight, stumbling over roots they could not see, slipping on mud that seemed to have no bottom. And then there were the diseases: malaria, dengue fever, dysentery, scrub typhus, tropical ulcers that could eat through flesh to the bone. More Australian soldiers would be evacuated due to illness than wounds during the entire campaign. But the greatest challenge was the track itself. The word track is almost a lie. In many places, there was no track at all. Just a vague suggestion of a path through undergrowth that reached head height. In other places, the track became a vertical scramble up muddy slopes so steep that soldiers had to pull themselves up by grabbing tree roots. Then they would reach the top, only to face an equally vertical descent on the other side. Down into another valley, across another river, up another mountain. Again and again and again. And the men sent to hold this nightmare had no idea what was coming for them. Into this nightmare marched the 39th Battalion. They had been in Papua for only a few weeks. They had received almost no jungle training. Their commanding officers had maps that were wildly inaccurate. And on the 21st of July 1942, they received orders that would define the next 3 months. Hold Kokoda. Stop the Japanese advance. Buy time for reinforcements to arrive. What the orders did not mention was that the Japanese force heading toward Kokoda numbered approximately 10,000 men. The 39th Battalion numbered around 500. The mathematics were clear. The outcome seemed inevitable. The Japanese plan was brutally simple. Land troops at Gona and Buna on the north coast, march them over the Owen Stanley Range via the Kokoda Track, capture Port Moresby, the last major Allied base in New Guinea, then use Port Moresby as a springboard to invade Australia itself. It was not paranoia. It was not propaganda. Japanese military planners had drawn up detailed invasion plans for the Australian mainland. Operation FS, it was called. Australia was to be isolated, bombed, and eventually occupied. The only thing standing between Japan and that goal was a handful of young Australians on a muddy track in the mountains. Colonel Yokoyama Yosuke commanded the Japanese South Seas Force advancing on Kokoda. His troops were veterans. They had fought in China. They had conquered Malaya. They had perfected the tactics of jungle infiltration that had shattered British defenses at Singapore. They moved at night. They cut communications. They outflanked defensive positions that should have been impregnable, and they were advancing far faster than anyone in Brisbane had expected. But here is where the official history starts to lie, because what saved the Australians was not what the generals planned. The Australian command had anticipated needing local assistance for one purpose only: carrying supplies. The official term was native carriers. The official attitude was colonial condescension. The Papuans were seen as laborers, not partners. They would carry ammunition forward. They would carry rations forward. They would be supervised by Australian officers who did not speak their language and did not understand their culture. That was the plan. The reality was entirely different. The Papuan people of the Owen Stanley region had their own relationship with the track. They had been walking these paths for thousands of years. They knew every water source. They knew which plants were edible and which were poison. They knew where the track was stable and where it would collapse under weight. They knew how to move through jungle without making a sound. And they understood something that the generals in Brisbane had completely failed to grasp. In this terrain, survival depended on knowledge, not firepower. When the first Australian patrols began moving up the track in late July, they were accompanied by Papuan carriers recruited from villages along the route. The Australians called them boys, a term that was patronizing at best, degrading at worst. The Papuans called themselves something else: carriers, workers, people doing a job for the strange white men who had suddenly appeared in their homeland with their loud voices and their heavy boots. The relationship was transactional. It would not stay that way. The first battle at Kokoda occurred on the night of the 28th and 29th of July, 1942. The Japanese attacked in darkness, as they always did. The 39th Battalion fought with everything they had. For 8 hours, the tiny Australian garrison held against overwhelming numbers. Then they were forced to withdraw. Lieutenant Colonel William Owen, the battalion commander, was fatally wounded in the fighting. He was 37 years old. He was one of the first to fall. He would not be the last. And this is when the mathematics of survival became the mathematics of impossible choices. A wounded soldier on the Western Front in 1917 could be evacuated by stretcher to a field hospital within hours. A wounded soldier at Tobruk in 1941 could be driven by ambulance to a surgical station. A wounded soldier on the Kokoda track in 1942 had no such options. There were no vehicles. There were no helicopters. There was no flat ground. There was only the track. And the only way to move a wounded man along the track was to carry him. The Australian Army Medical Corps had established aid posts along the route, but the aid posts could only provide basic treatment. Serious casualties needed evacuation to Port Moresby, and the distance from the forward positions to Port Moresby was approximately 100 kilometers of the worst terrain on Earth. The official estimate for evacuating a single stretcher case was 8 days. 8 days of being carried over mountains, across rivers, through mud and rain and darkness. 8 days of agony for the wounded man. 8 days of back-breaking labor for the carriers. The standard military stretcher of 1942 was designed for 4 bearers on flat ground. On the Kokoda track, it was useless. The track was too narrow. The slopes were too steep. The standard method could not work. And so the Papuan carriers invented a new method. They would carry a wounded man on a makeshift stretcher slung between two poles, two carriers at the front, two carriers at the back. But on the steep sections, the angles became impossible, so they adapted again. One carrier would walk backward, holding the stretcher high above his head, while the carrier behind him crouched almost to the ground. The wounded man would remain level while the carriers compensated for the slope with their own bodies. Try to imagine the physical demands of this work. A wounded Australian soldier weighed approximately 70 to 80 kilograms. Add the weight of the stretcher, the water canteens, the medical supplies. The carriers themselves weighed perhaps 60 kilograms each. They were carrying more than their own body weight up vertical slopes, in mud that sucked at their feet, in rain that never stopped, on rations that were barely sufficient for walking, let alone hauling. And they did it barefoot. But that was only the beginning of what made them different. The Papuan carriers did not wear boots. They never had. Their feet were adapted to the terrain in ways that leather and rubber could never match. They could grip mud that would send a booted foot sliding. They could feel the texture of roots and rocks beneath their toes. They moved through the jungle with a grace that the Australians could only envy. And they did it while carrying burdens that would have broken men twice their size. But the physical feat, as remarkable as it was, is not why we remember them. We remember them because of what happened when the carrying was done. The first accounts began to filter back to Australia in September 1942. Soldiers returning from the track spoke of Papuan carriers who refused to leave their patients, carriers who stayed awake through the night to keep wounded men warm, carriers who shared their own rations when supplies ran out, carriers who sang softly in the darkness to calm soldiers screaming from pain. One account described a carrier who walked beside a stretcher for 72 hours straight, holding the hand of a man who could not stop shaking. When the soldier finally reached the hospital in Port Moresby, he asked for the carrier by name. He wanted to thank him. The carrier had already walked back up the track to fetch another wounded man. These were not the actions of laborers following orders, and what the soldiers discovered next shattered everything they thought they knew. The colonial framework that had defined the relationship between Australians and Papuans shattered on the Kokoda track. Something new emerged in its place. Something that the men who experienced it struggled to put into words for the rest of their lives. The fighting grew more desperate as August turned to September. The Japanese had captured Kokoda village. They had pushed the Australians back to Isarava. They had pushed them back to Brigade Hill. Every day, the line retreated further south. Every day, more wounded men needed evacuation. And every day, the Papuan carriers kept walking. Sergeant Bert Kinzel was one of the few Australians who understood what was happening. Kinzel had lived in Papua before the war. He spoke Pidgin English fluently. He knew the local villages, and he knew that the carrier system was on the verge of collapse. The official recruitment process treated Papuans as interchangeable units of labor. A carrier would be recruited from his village, marched to a supply dump, loaded with 60 pounds of rice or ammunition, and pointed toward the front. He was expected to make the journey, deposit his load, and return for more. No one asked if he had eaten. No one asked if he was sick. No one asked if he had family waiting for news. Kinzel fought against this system with every tool he had. He argued with supply officers. He shouted at quartermasters. He threatened to report anyone who mistreated the carriers. He won some battles and lost others. But the Papuans did not wait for the system to treat them fairly. They created their own systems of mutual aid. Carriers from the same village would share food and shelter. They would rotate the heaviest burdens among themselves. They would slow their pace to match the weakest member of the group rather than leaving him behind. But the stretcher bearers were different, and what they did went far beyond any duty. The stretcher bearers were a different category entirely. The regular carriers moved supplies. The stretcher bearers moved men. And somewhere in the chaos of those terrible months, the stretcher bearers became something more than employees of the Australian Army. They became guardians. Private George Whittington was wounded at Yora Creek on the 6th of September 1942. A Japanese bullet had shattered his femur. In any other theater of war, such a wound would have meant rapid evacuation and surgery within hours. At Yora Creek, it meant being loaded onto a stretcher and beginning a journey that would last 12 days. The Papuan carriers assigned to his stretcher were Raphael Oimbari, Ovaru Ndiki Auna, and others whose names were never recorded. What they did for Whittington became one of the defining stories of the campaign. The wound was catastrophic. Whittington was in constant pain. He could not lie flat on the stretcher because the position put pressure on the broken bone. So the carriers improvised. They adjusted the stretcher at every rest stop, trying different angles to minimize his suffering. They chewed taro root into paste and fed it to him when he was too weak to eat solid food. They cleaned his wound as best they could with rainwater. They kept him warm when fever struck, covering him with their own blankets. And through it all, they talked to him. In broken English, in pidgin, in their own language that Whittington could not understand. They talked to him because they knew that silence would let the fear in. But the photograph that would make them famous captured only a single moment. The truth was far more extraordinary. The photograph that survives tells part of the story. It shows Whittington prone on a stretcher, being carried across a river by 4 Papuan men. Raphael Oimbari is in the lead, the stretcher pole resting on his shoulder, his face a mask of concentration. The water is up to their chests. The current is clearly strong. One slip would send all 5 men into the rapids. None of them slipped. But the photograph does not capture the 12 days before that moment. It does not capture the 8 days after. It does not capture the simple fact that Raphael Oimbari and his fellow carriers made a choice. They chose to treat George Whittington not as cargo, but as a friend. They chose to keep him alive when every circumstance argued for letting him fade. They chose to perform acts of kindness that no one would ever order them to perform. This is the heart of the story. And this is why we are telling it more than 80 years later. The term Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels did not emerge from military records. It emerged from the soldiers themselves. The name came from the hair of the Papuan carriers, which they wore in the traditional style of the Highlands, teased out into a distinctive halo. The angels part needs no explanation. The men who were carried down that track by those carriers knew exactly what to call them. The phrase first appeared in print in October 1942. A poem titled Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels was published in Australian newspapers, written by a soldier named Sapper Bert Barros. The poem spread rapidly through the civilian population. It was recited at RSL meetings. It was read aloud on radio broadcasts. It became, for a time, as famous as any verse from Banjo Patterson. But behind the poetry lay a question that no one wanted to answer. Why did they really do it? Why did the carriers do it? This is the question that historians have debated for decades. The practical answer is that they were employed to do a job. They were paid in trade goods. They were under the authority of the Australian administration. Refusing to work was not a realistic option. But this explanation falls apart when you examine what the carriers actually did versus what they were required to do. They were required to carry stretchers. They were not required to stay awake through the night comforting frightened men. They were required to transport wounded soldiers. They were not required to share their own food when supplies ran short. They were required to follow orders. They were not required to love. The deeper answer lies in Papuan culture itself. The concept of caring for the sick and wounded was central to village life in the highlands. A man who fell ill was not abandoned. He was cared for by his family, his neighbors, his community. The wounded Australians became, in the eyes of the carriers, their responsibility. Not their burden, their responsibility. And that responsibility did not end when the job description said it should. But we must be careful, because what history tried to hide was far darker than any poem suggested. The story of the fuzzy Wuzzy angels is a story of extraordinary compassion. It is also a story of extraordinary exploitation. The Papuan carriers were not volunteers in any meaningful sense. They were conscripted by an Australian administration that had controlled their territory for 40 years. They were paid rates that were a fraction of what Australian soldiers earned. They were given rations that were inadequate for the work they were doing. They were exposed to diseases that their communities had never encountered. And when they fell sick or collapsed from exhaustion, they were often simply left behind. The casualty figures tell part of the story. Approximately 2,700 Papuans served as carriers during the Kokoda campaign. At least 400 of them are believed to have lost their lives, but the true number will never be known. The Australian Army did not keep precise records of Papuan casualties. The carriers were, in the accounting systems of 1942, something less than soldiers. Their names went unrecorded. Their sacrifices went uncompensated. Their families received no pensions. Their villages received no memorials. This is the shadow that falls across every celebration of the fuzzy Wuzzy angels. The men who carried George Whittington to safety did so out of genuine human compassion. They also did so within a system that treated them as disposable labor. Both of these things are true. Both of these things must be remembered. And while the angels walked through hell, the generals were about to make their biggest blunder yet. The Australian retreat continued through August and into September. Isurava fell after 4 days of savage fighting. Brigade Hill fell after the Japanese outflanked the Australian position. Yoribaiwa fell when ammunition ran out. By mid-September, the Japanese had advanced to within 48 kilometers of Port Moresby. Australian commanders began preparing for the final defense of the city. Emergency demolition charges were placed on key bridges and airfields. Evacuation plans were drawn up for civilian personnel. The situation was, by any objective measure, desperate. And then something changed. The Japanese advance stopped, not because of a single battle, not because of a dramatic last stand. The advance stopped because the Japanese supply line had finally broken. Every bullet fired at Yoribaiwa had been carried over the Owen Stanley Range on the backs of Japanese soldiers. Every bag of rice, every mortar shell, every drop of medicine. The Japanese had no equivalent of the Papuan carriers. They had relied on their own troops to serve as porters, which meant that for every combat soldier at the front, 2 or 3 soldiers were occupied with supply duties behind. The mathematics had caught up with them. On the 24th of September 1942, the Japanese began their withdrawal. They had come within striking distance of Port Moresby. They would never come that close again. But the Australian command was not satisfied with survival, and the orders that came next would demand even more from the Angels. General Thomas Blamey, commander of Allied land forces in the Southwest Pacific, issued new orders: pursue, destroy, recapture Kokoda. The Australian counteroffensive began in late September. Fresh troops had finally arrived from Australia. The 7th Division, battle-hardened veterans from North Africa, took over from the exhausted militia battalions that had held the line for 2 months. The advance began to move the other way along the track. Kokoda was recaptured on the 2nd of November. The Japanese were pushed back to Gona and Buna on the north coast. The campaign that had begun with desperate defense ended with grinding offensive operations that would continue until January 1943. And throughout this reversal, the Papuan carriers kept walking. The counteroffensive required even more supplies than the retreat. Every round of ammunition for the advance on Gona had to be carried forward. Every wounded man from the fighting had to be carried back. The demand on the carrier system was greater than ever, and the supply of willing carriers was shrinking. Villages along the track had been stripped of able-bodied men. Disease had taken a toll. Exhaustion had taken a worse one. The system that had held together through the darkest months was beginning to fray. This was when the true character of the Australians would be revealed, and not all of them passed the test. During the retreat, the Australians had been dependent on the carriers for survival. Gratitude had been easy. During the advance, the Australians had momentum, firepower, and confidence. It would have been easy to slip back into the colonial attitudes of before, to treat the carriers as labor units again, to forget the angels who had carried their mates through hell. Some Australians did forget. The records show incidents of carriers being mistreated, of rations being withheld, of promises being broken. But many Australians remembered. They fought to ensure the carriers were fed. They argued with their officers about rest periods. They shared their own cigarettes, their own chocolate, their own letters from home. The bond that had formed in extremity did not evaporate in victory. It changed shape, but it survived. The story of the Kokoda track is often told as a story of Australian heroism. And it was. The diggers who held Isarava against impossible odds deserve every honor their nation can bestow. The soldiers who marched back up the track to recapture what had been lost deserve their place in the national memory. But the story is incomplete without the Papuan carriers. Without their knowledge, the Australian force would have been blind. Without their labor, the Australian force would have been starving. Without their compassion, the Australian wounded would have perished in the mud of the Owen Stanley Range. But here is where history committed its greatest betrayal. The immediate aftermath of the Kokoda campaign saw some recognition of the carriers' contribution. The Australian government issued a statement praising their service. A handful of carriers received medals. The photograph of Raphael Oimbari carrying George Whittington was published in newspapers and became one of the iconic images of the war in the Pacific. But when the war ended, the recognition largely stopped. Papua New Guinea remained under Australian administration until 1975. During those 30 years, the veterans of the carrier force received little in the way of ongoing support. No pensions, no medical care, no formal acknowledgement of their status as wartime personnel. They had served the Australian Army during its hour of greatest need. They had been forgotten when the need passed. The contrast with how Australia treated its own veterans was stark. Australian soldiers received repatriation benefits, housing assistance, medical care, and access to the RSL network that provided community and support for the rest of their lives. Papuan carriers received nothing. The angels had done their work. The angels could go back to their villages. This injustice persisted for decades. It was not until the 1990s that sustained efforts began to provide proper recognition. In 2009, the Australian government finally established a special commemorative medallion for the surviving carriers and their descendants. By that time, almost all of the original carriers had passed on. The men who had carried the wounded through hell went to their own ends without ever seeing justice. But one man lived long enough to witness the world finally remember. Raphael Oimbari lived until 2011. He was one of the last surviving stretcher bearers of the Kokoda campaign. In his final years, he received some of the recognition he had been denied for so long. Australian journalists interviewed him. Australian veterans made pilgrimages to his village to thank him in person. The photograph that had made him famous, showing him carrying George Whittington across the river, was finally attached to a name and a life story, rather than being just another piece of war iconography. Oimbari spoke about the campaign in interviews conducted through interpreters. He spoke about the weight of the stretchers. He spoke about the mud that never dried. He spoke about the fear of Japanese patrols finding them on the track. But when asked why he had done it, why he had given so much for men he barely knew, his answer was simple. They were hurt. We helped them. What else would we do? This answer may seem insufficient. Surely there must be some deeper motivation, some complex cultural or economic explanation for the extraordinary sacrifices of the Papuan carriers. But perhaps the answer really is that simple. They saw men in pain. They helped. What else would they do? The question reflects more on us than on them. And the answer exposes something uncomfortable about our modern world. We live in a world that has become cynical about altruism. We assume that kindness must have an ulterior motive. We struggle to believe that strangers would sacrifice for strangers without expecting something in return. The fuzzy, wuzzy angels challenge that cynicism. They remind us that human beings are capable of extraordinary compassion when circumstances strip away the comfortable barriers of ordinary life. The Kokoda track today is a place of pilgrimage. Thousands of Australians walk the track every year, following in the footsteps of the diggers and the carriers who made the campaign possible. The journey takes approximately 8 days for modern trekkers. They carry lightweight packs with freeze-dried food and Gore-Tex rain jackets. They are guided by Papuan porters who know the track as their grandfathers did. They struggle through the same mud, climb the same ridges, cross the same rivers. And when they reach the end, many of them weep. The trek has become a form of secular pilgrimage for Australians seeking to connect with their national identity. It is marketed as a test of endurance, a journey of self-discovery, a way to honor the sacrifice of those who came before. And for many trekkers, it genuinely is all of those things. But there is a danger in this pilgrimage, and almost no one wants to talk about it. The danger is turning a complex history into a simple story. The danger is remembering the heroism while forgetting the exploitation. The danger is celebrating the angels while ignoring the system that conscripted them. The Papuan communities along the track today have a complicated relationship with the Kokoda industry. Tourism brings income to villages that have few other economic opportunities. Guiding work provides employment for young men who might otherwise have to migrate to Port Moresby, but the distribution of benefits is uneven. The Australian companies that operate the treks capture most of the revenue. The Papuan guides and porters are often paid wages that remain far below Australian standards. The colonial dynamics of 1942 have not entirely disappeared. They have simply taken new forms. What do we owe to the descendants of the fuzzy Wuzzy angels? This is not merely a historical question. It is a question with implications for the present day. The Australian government has taken some steps toward acknowledgement in recent decades. The Kokoda Track Foundation was established to provide educational and health services to communities along the track. Infrastructure projects have been funded to improve conditions in villages that were once the homes of the carriers. Annual commemorations bring together Australian veterans and Papuan community leaders to remember the shared sacrifice of their ancestors. But the scale of the debt is greater than any foundation or commemorative medallion can repay. And here is why. The Papuan carriers saved an unknown number of Australian lives during the Kokoda campaign. They did so at a cost to their own communities that has never been fully calculated. They did so within a colonial system that treated them as resources rather than partners. And they did so with a grace and compassion that their Australian beneficiaries struggled to comprehend. The lesson of the fuzzy Wuzzy angels is not simply that Papuans were kind to Australians in a time of crisis. The lesson is that kindness can emerge from the most unlikely circumstances when people choose to see each other as human beings rather than as categories. The Australian soldiers who arrived in Papua in 1942 carried with them all the prejudices of their era. They had been raised in a country where Aboriginal people were not counted in the census. They had grown up with newspapers that routinely described non-white peoples in dehumanizing terms. They had been told that they were fighting to protect white Australia from the yellow peril. And then they met the carriers. And the carriers did not fit any of the categories they had been given. The transformation was not instant. It was not universal. Some Australians maintained their prejudices throughout the campaign and beyond, but many were changed by what they witnessed on the track. They returned to Australia with stories of Papuan courage and compassion that challenged the racial assumptions of their society. They spoke at RSL meetings about the angels who had saved their lives. They wrote letters to newspapers calling for proper recognition of the carrier's service. They named their children after the men who had carried them through hell. This is one of the more remarkable outcomes of the Kokoda campaign. And it happened despite everything the system tried to prevent. In the midst of a war that was framed in explicitly racial terms, a bond formed between Australians and Papuans that transcended the ideology of the conflict. The soldiers who fought on the Kokoda track did not return home as advocates for civil rights or opponents of the White Australia policy. They remained men of their time with all the limitations that implies. But they also remained men who had seen something that contradicted the comfortable assumptions of their world. They had seen black men save white men for no reason other than common humanity. They could not unsee it. The final message of the Kokoda story is one of uncomfortable complexity. We want our war stories to be simple. We want heroes and villains, courage and cowardice, victory and defeat. The Kokoda campaign offers all of these elements, but it also offers something more difficult. It offers a story in which the heroes were partially complicit in an unjust system. It offers a story in which the saved were also the oppressors. It offers a story in which gratitude and exploitation existed side by side. The diggers who fought on the Kokoda track deserve their place in Australian memory. They held the line against impossible odds. They marched back up the track to recapture what had been lost. They endured conditions that would have broken lesser men. They earned the pride of their nation. But they did not do it alone. And here is the truth that took 80 years to speak aloud. They did it with the help of men whose names were not recorded in the official histories. Men who walked barefoot through mud and rain and darkness. Men who carried the wounded on their shoulders across rivers and up mountains. Men who stayed awake through the night to comfort soldiers they barely knew. Men who were paid in trade goods and treated as laborers and forgotten when the war was over. The fuzzy, wuzzy angels did not fight for Australia. They were not citizens of Australia. They had no stake in the outcome of the war beyond the immediate presence of armed men in their homeland. And yet, they gave everything they had to keep Australian soldiers alive. They gave their strength. They gave their knowledge. They gave their compassion. They gave without expecting anything in return. This is the soul of Kokoda. Not the tactical victories, not the strategic significance. The soul of Kokoda is the moment when Raphael Oimbari knelt beside George Whittington in the mud and decided that this stranger was worth saving. The generals had failed. The supply lines had collapsed. The war plan had fallen apart. But one man looked at another man in pain and made a choice. They were hurt. We helped them. What else would we do? The track still runs through the Owen Stanley Range. The mountains have not changed. The rivers still rise with the rains. The jungle still closes in on anyone who stops moving for too long. Walk the track today and you will see the same terrain that nearly broke the diggers of the 39th Battalion. You will climb the same ridges that the carriers climbed with wounded men on their shoulders. You will cross the same rivers that claimed so many lives. But you will not see what made the Kokoda campaign different from any other battle of the Second World War. You will not see the moments of quiet compassion that occurred in the darkness. You will not see the hands that reached out to steady a stumbling soldier. You will not see the songs that were sung to calm the terrified wounded. You will not see the choices that were made, again and again, by men who had every reason to walk away and chose instead to stay. Those moments are invisible now. They exist only in the memories of those who witnessed them, and those witnesses are almost all gone. What remains is the story, and the responsibility of telling that story honestly, with all its complexity, all its heroism, and all its shame. The fuzzy, wuzzy angels did not ask to be angels, but what they became cannot be forgotten. They were men doing a job under impossible conditions. They discovered, in the process, a capacity for compassion that surprised everyone, including themselves. They saved lives that would otherwise have been lost. They changed minds that would otherwise have remained closed. They created a bond between two peoples that persists in complicated and imperfect ways to this day. And when the war was over, they went home, to their villages, to their families, to lives that continued without fanfare or recognition. Most of them never received a medal. Most of them never saw a pension check. Most of them went to their rest without ever hearing the words that their Australian patients would have given anything to say. Thank you. The photograph of Raphael Oimbari carrying George Whittington hangs in the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. It is one of the most reproduced images in Australian military history. Every Anzac Day, when Australians gather to remember their war heroes, some of them think of that photograph. Some of them remember that the heroes were not all wearing Australian uniforms. Whittington survived the war. He married. He raised a family. He lived until 1999. In his later years, he spoke publicly about what Oimbari and the other carriers had done for him. He never forgot the 12 days on the stretcher. He never forgot the hands that fed him when he was too weak to lift his own arms. He never forgot the voice that sang to him in the darkness. Oimbari survived the war too. He returned to his village. He worked the land. He raised his own family. He lived to see the world finally begin to acknowledge what he and his fellow carriers had done. In 2009, at a ceremony in Papua New Guinea, he was presented with a medallion by the Australian government. It was 67 years late. It was not enough. But it was something. The two men never met again after 1942. But what connected them could never be broken. The soldier and the angel. The saved and the savior. They lived out their lives on opposite sides of the Coral Sea, connected by a bond that neither time nor distance could break. This is what war does. It brings together people who would never otherwise meet. It forces them into intimacies that peace would never permit. And sometimes, in the chaos and the terror and the mud, something emerges that defies every expectation. Something that looks, in retrospect, like grace. The generals in Brisbane never understood what happened on the Kokoda track. They looked at their maps and saw terrain features. They looked at their charts and saw supply lines. They looked at their casualty reports and saw numbers. They never saw the moments that made the difference. They never saw a carrier refuse to abandon a wounded man. They never saw a soldier weep with gratitude for a stranger's kindness. They never saw the soul of the campaign. General MacArthur received a Medal of Honor for his leadership in the Pacific. General Blamey received a knighthood. The men who drew the maps and issued the orders were decorated and promoted and remembered in histories that bear their names. The carriers received trade goods. And then, for decades, they received nothing at all. But here is what the generals missed, and what the histories often miss as well. The Kokoda campaign was won by the diggers who held the line. But the diggers survived because of the carriers who kept them alive. Strategy is made in headquarters. Tactics are decided in the field. But survival happens in the space between two human beings who choose to help each other. This is the lesson of the fuzzy, wuzzy angels. This is the soul of Kokoda. They were hurt. We helped them. What else would we do?